Hey, I'm Lurpus. I played Counter-Strike for a living for 8 years. I've been on the desk for some of the biggest events for 5 years. I know nothing about Counter-Strike, but then again, neither does Thorin. Welcome to his YouTube channel.
I have a clips channel where they post little shorter clips of just specific topics with the name of the topic in the title, so you can just see it without having to look through a whole video if you don't know what I was talking about in an interview. The concept for this video, in-game leader trees, is basically something I took from a premise I saw in the NFL, actually, where what they do is they have this concept called the NFL coaching tree. And so they'll take a legendary coach and they'll show how people who were assistant coaches under him became head coaches elsewhere or assistant coaches elsewhere. And oftentimes the really great coaches, you can see part of how good they were at coaching by some of the effect they possibly had on other coaches around them. Or you can sometimes see how great they were by what they essentially took on as their load and maybe where they didn't delegate. And so this other guy who, when he was on their staff, might have looked like he was doing an awesome job in this one regard, actually didn't have maybe opportunity to develop or become a great coach elsewhere. And so a very, very famous one is Bill Parcells' coaching tree, the coach of the New York Giants in the 80s to early 90s, because this was a guy where in this time period, he won 2 Super Bowls. Not only did he have a whole bunch of people who came from him, Tom Coughlin, who won the 2 Giants championships in the 2000s, 2010s, the ones with Eli Manning, Sean Payton, who won the Super Bowl with the Saints over the Colts. But most famously, the Bill Parcells coaching tree has arguably the greatest coach ever, unless you're a fan of the 70s. Bill Belichick comes from the Bill Parcells coaching tree. Now, interestingly enough, this is another concept within the coaching tree premise, is Bill Belichick has his own coaching tree, but his coaching tree is way less successful than his mentor, Bill Parcells. So Bill Belichick has, like in the early days, I think it was when he was with the Browns, where he actually had a couple of decent seasons. He had Nick Saban, the Alabama coach, was from there. Eric Mangini of the Jets. Obviously, you now often see him on like talk shows. Josh McDaniels, obviously, got all that acclaim for that fucking amazing offense in the 2000s, and then he went and tried being the head coach of the Broncos. He had his issues, clearly. He was even supposed to go and be the coach of a team, I think it was the Colts or something, like a couple of years ago, but he turned it down. So being as coaches in CSGO are way less of a thing. Like, they are coaches there, but they don't have so much history behind them. Most of them were just in-game leaders anyway. There hasn't been time for them to have big staff, or if they have a staff, it's an analyst who doesn't tend to go on to do much more than that. Basically, in this sense, it's more logical to expand this premise into Counter-Strike and have a thought exercise, but just using in-game leaders instead of coaches. So I thought what we do is I went through and I picked out loads of different ones from CSGO, from Source, from 1.6 to establish the point, and then we'll kind of get into the reason why. So I'll start out with one that's probably going to surprise you, which is gla1ve. So gla1ve, one of the best 1.6 in-game leaders ever, a truly great in-game leader. In CSGO, he was even very good. I don't think he's quite at the same level, but then again, it's a different game. I also didn't think it plays to his strengths of tactics as much as 1.6. Now, what a lot of people might not know is Carrigan was under gla1ve in late 2014 when he was in Mouse Sports. And obviously the next year is when Carrigan embraced fully being an in-game leader, became the in-game leader of Dignitas, later TSM, later Astralis, and he's become one of the great in-game leaders himself, arguably surpassed his mentor, although he hasn't won a major yet like gla1ve did in 1.6. So some of Carrigan's success, you can even probably talk to the guy, he'll tell you that gla1ve was a brilliant guy. Some of it perhaps comes from being around gla1ve, seeing how gla1ve calls, gla1ve's calls. He even actually, considering he was a tactical in-game leader and he had great utility usage, he even had pretty good mid-round calls as well, which is obviously one of the specialties of Carrigan, right? Then we've got to consider the IGL of big right now, Tabson. This guy was a superstar player at one point in time a year or two ago, or at very least a very good star player. And going years back before that, he was always an individual talent, a prospect. He's played under gla1ve on a number of occasions. Now he actually took over, and guess what? He's leading a pretty tactical team. Thanks, I think, to some of the mentorship of gla1ve in that regard and playing within gla1ve's system, seeing how gla1ve thought about the game, set the game up, called the game. So then let's go to another one. How about one of my favourites? In my opinion, the greatest in-game leader of all time in any version of CS is gla1ve. I'd have to go between him and gla1ve right now, but I have to do that another time. gla1ve, the MTW 2008 to 2011, in-game leader. Also was an in-game leader for NOA before that, before they changed the name to MTW, but this were the prime years of him. Truly amazing IGL. He was like gla1ve in the sense that he just always tends to call a very good match. Even if he loses, it's really hard to beat his teams. They're always in the game. They can always grind back. It's very rare they ever get blown out. And so one of the reasons why I actually think gla1ve has a connection, but very indirectly through to Ave, is even though he was never a true IGL much in CSGO, Zonic, the coach of Astralis, who I think has had a big impact on gla1ve, it was obviously a player for many years in Ave's system and a secondary caller at times. Oh, by the way, Zonic, after playing with Ave, even was under God B a little bit in the late mouse spots at the very end of 1.6. So then gla1ve connects into Zonic. Interesting connection, right? So let's go to gla1ve, one of the greatest in-game leaders of all time, arguably the best ever in CSGO. What a lot of people might not know is MSL was a support player in gla1ve's Western Wolves team at the beginning of CSGO, and years later, after not being able to make it much as a support player, tried it in the fetish Copenhagen Wolves later, I think it was Copenhagen Wolves later than that. Eventually, he became an in-game leader, became a pretty good in-game leader. gla1ve has a pretty nice tree, by the way. Interesting angle. Even though I'm not going to claim Snappy directly on the gla1ve coaching tree, I think you have to point out that Snappy was the primary in-game leader of Team X that became Heroic. And in Heroic, gla1ve played, but he was mainly a fragger and he was a secondary caller. And you can go ask Snappy. He'll tell you he learned some things, some concepts about when to call, how to call from the secondary calling of gla1ve, because it was after that team that gla1ve went to Astralis and they became one of the best teams in the world, won the next major. So interesting detail, Snappy himself was under the Hunden coaching tree, which we'll get to in a moment, especially in that UNU Aino, UNU AIN team. Now, interestingly, who is the current IGL of Astralis? Last time I checked, apparently it's Magisk. So that means Magisk was actually the in-game leader for Road to Rio and the ESL Pro League Season 12 wins. That's what I saw someone say. I believe it was said by the team online. So if that's the case, has he not had a knock-on effect from playing with gla1ve? I mean, he played under him for so many years. I'm sure in that team they have great communication. He probably puts in calls. He's a pretty clever player, Magisk, in the game. Interestingly enough, Magisk obviously previously, when he was in Dignitas and North, played under MSL. So some of the coaching, the IGLing tree here is almost a little bit incestuous, but the point is, it's getting to be around all these great in-game leaders and good in-game leaders that helped some of these guys develop and then eventually embrace the role themselves. So now let's go to one of the daddies of being this IGL coaching tree, and that is fucking Hunden, my dude. Because not only has he been around all this time in CSGO, but this guy at the end of Source was around. So as a result, gla1ve was playing in his teams in Source, Reason Gaming, Copenhagen Wolves. I think Snappy was in his Copenhagen Wolves team in CSGO before Snappy really took off and got the heroic gig, etc. Asilian, who at one point in time was just a player, Copenhagen Wolves, he was playing with Hunden as well. A whole bunch of people. Obviously, Asilian won with Mad Lions, won Flashpoint 1. Obviously, Snappy, top 4 at IEM Katowice in 2017. Had a bunch of other nice placings when Heroic was a solid, a top 8/playoff team. How about then let's go to some old school people, right? So let's go back to my boy Khan. CGO Fnatic now, one of the great 1.6 leaders, more of a loose style. Well, do you know who played under him towards the end, last couple of years, last year and a half or so, and who actually seems like the spiritual successor to Khan in the style of how he called and what he did within the game? Decent clutcher, could be an alright fragger for his position. It's got to be Exist. Exist was under him in Fnatic, and then when CSGO came out, he moved over to NIP, and he was the IGL. He'd been the IGL at the very, very end of the Fnatic period after Khan had retired. Now, interestingly, Exist is really touched by greatness, because across all angles, he played under Pronax in H2K, he played under Threat in Lions, played under Khan, and then he comes and becomes his own in-game leader, and even has input from Flaren, etc. So you can see how the 1.6 lineage is coming into CSGO. Similarly, who was one of my favourite IGL for most of CSGO? It's, of course, the legendary Existence, arguably the greatest sourcing game leader of all time. I'll admit, Source not my game, so when I talk about all these ones, this is research, things I've heard. I'm not claiming to have the expert knowledge on this, just to lay out the case. What a lot of people won't know is, there have been many interviews I've seen back in the day where, from memory, I remember Existence referencing Hearts, probably the greatest 1.6 French in-game leader, the in-game leader of the Emulate team, That was fantastic. He even was briefly the in-game leader in CSGO, actually. People don't know. From what I remember, I think he was the IGL of the Clan Mystic team that won ESWC 2013 and actually beat VatriGames when they were the best team in the world. It was a miracle upset. And possibly one of their cheaters, possibly one, maybe two of their players who were cheating. I'll just put that out there. Now, under Existence, his coaching tree is a mixed bag. Because NBK is right there. NBK came up under Existence, played with Existence many years, then obviously went off, went with Happy. He was touched by Happy in that sense. Has never been a great in-game leader, quite frankly. Similar for Shocks. He was only really a decent in-game leader when he was just fragging out of control, but he came up under Existence. That's one of the reasons he brought Existence back in 2018, because he thought this is the only true in-game leader I've had for many years. Alex, a lot of people might not know, when he was in LDLC, was under Existence, was learning things from him, even talked about it in his interview with me. Apex obviously played in Titan for a long time, and in that team sometimes would secondary call. That's why I was surprised it took them so long in G2 to actually test that in late 2017. And obviously, Apex is now the IGL of Vitality, although admittedly, we're online, and obviously his coach Stars could obviously have a lot of input. And I'll say this as well, Apex most recently played under Alex, so he's been somewhat touched by all these guys. He was under Shocks and MBK when they were IGLs, so this guy's had it all around him. He might not be a great IGL himself, we'll see about that, but he's certainly been touched by greatness, right? Here's one you probably don't know. How about Taz from 1.6, the original classic leader of the polls when they won a lot of their majors? So Cuban, the leader of the team later on, was under Taz before that. Neo, who in CSGO, they had a lot of their successes with him as the Virtus Pro IGL, obviously playing under Taz for many, many years and adapting his own role. Here's probably one that'll surprise you. As much as you make fun of Kane, the old Pro 100 or Prosta, as he's supposed to say in like Russian or whatever, from way back in the day, who was obviously the coach of Na'Vi, who was a bit useless and was in the Gambit, etc. If you go way back in time to his 1.6 days, he was the in-game leader of Zeus, who was just a fragger, and then Zeus also played under Alex, I think, when he was the IGL. Zeus obviously himself became the greatest IGL ever from that region, was in 10 major finals across both games. He's underneath the Kane IGL tree. Then you have Starix, played under Zeus. And then admittedly, it was when he came out of the game and was a coach, but he could essentially do the IGL job before the coaching ban. Was the best in the world, in my opinion, at that time. Doing an amazing job. He's under the Zeus, under the Kane IGL tree. How about legendary players from Norway? Best leaders ever. Executor and Element. Well, Executor came up under Hib, who was the AWPA and the IGL, very loose IGL, for NIP in 2000 and 2001. And then Executor played under him. Executor then went later, played also with Eolithic, where he was the IGL. And then he had Element under him. And then later on, Executor played with Veslin as well. And there was an IGL after that. Became one of the great tactical IGLs. And then Element was one of the great feel IGLs. He reads the game and he learned how to feel. And a lot of that came from Executor. Came from the players that, notice how, again, it's incestuous because they're all sharing knowledge. They're all learning from each other. They're all taking things from everyone they're around. In the same way as a great player should take things from the people he plays around. Then, I was talking about Executor and Veslin. How about Veslin with Executor under him? Veslin was one of the great early Swedish IGLs when actually Swedes weren't doing a lot of tactics. He was trying to be a threat of his day, as it were. One from North America people might not know is people love Trip from the classic Complexity lineup, right? And even though he was an IGL before that, I think in DOF, he actually came up with his success under Hare, Moses' older brother, who was actually a pretty good IGL. Like, he was doing a lot of work on demos and tactics, and he was also a decent fragger. Maybe not the most genius IGL, but certainly put in the hours, and I respected him a lot for being from North America and taking this approach. And then not only was he working with Fraud and these other players, Sonman, but crucially, actually, was Sonman even in that team? No, it was later on. Crucially for me, Trip was under him, and I saw Trip, I felt like he took some, like, even if it was just as a spiritual successor of that into Complexity later. How about in end of 1.6? Valle went from being a superstar AWPer to an IGL, I think it was around the NIP period, like 2006 onwards, was an IGL of SK for many, many years. And then Robban played with him in a lot of these teams, and later became the IGL of SK. And basically, Valle was famous for making, like, I think something like 5 major finals and not winning any. Robban also was in most of those major finals and didn't win. And at the end, though, when Valle was gone, he got Get Right and Forest and he got to win ESWC 2011. And by all rights, I think should have won WCG 2012. But he kind of fucked it up. So, and maybe even the IEM the next year, but with the super team with Trace. So, very interesting stuff, right? Now, the reason I made all these cases, and I purposely pick people where they connect back into a different guy, who connects into a different guy, who maybe connects to the original guy, is because this concept isn't just about listing off names. The point I'm making is, when you want to be an in-game leader, it's going to help you a lot at your beginning period if you aren't just starting from zero and just looking at other people. If you're instead having someone who was touched by greatness, you were there when a great in-game leader was calling. You talked to that in-game leader. You worked on things with that. You were able to maybe reach out to them when you become an in-game leader and ask them for advice, ask them what they're doing in this sense. Most difficult game role to learn is in-game leader. It's the toughest of all because it's a role that has a million different aspects to it, especially if your coach isn't very good. You have to build the tactics in the playbook, which means that you have to then, after you built the tactics, be able to read what the opponent's doing and know which tactic to play. It's really hard to stick with your tactics in your playbook when just nothing's working. Your players are all losing all the 1v1s and 2v2s, or the entry guy just dies every time, or the lurker doesn't watch the flank properly. And as a result, you're just getting wrecked, but you're thinking, is my tactic wrong? Are they executing it wrong? Is it too hard for them to execute? Do I have to go simpler, or should I go more in-depth, actually, as a hard counter to the opponent? That's it's really tough. A lot of secondary callers get caught in this trap of wanting to be an IGL because they just call when they have a cool idea or when they're feeling it. And then the rest of the time, they let the other guy call. So they think, oh, my ideas are brilliant, and his aren't. Are you listening, Alu? That's you, my dude. But then when they have to be the IGL, it's fucking garbage because they're calling all game long and they're trying to do their shit as well. It's really hard, right? So the strategy element is tough. I'm talking about now like the macro idea of what are we doing overall and how are we matching up in terms of the pace that we're playing versus the opponent. And what is our general approach to the game versus their general approach, a meta game approach. If you get figured out stylistically in your strategy, you can have the best tactics in the world and they might not work. It's one of the reasons why, in my opinion, some of the Team Liquid teams just went owned by the Astralis teams. Astralis were inside their heads, mind controlling them. Because even though sometimes the tactics or the players were okay, they were playing at the wrong pace, they were playing stylistically wrong, they were basically figured out in that regard. So part of this strategy component is you've got to scout your opponents. That's really tough. You're not just watching a demo, you're breaking it down and figuring out how you can use what you take from it. Then you're figuring out the roles people should play. Sometimes stars play the wrong roles for themselves and they don't know that, but you swap them to a different role and that your team's way better. Then there's the balance of where do I put certain egos and what sites and will they have good communication and do these roles work over here and do we have enough skill in this role or is it another role that's actually he's picking up the slack for this guy and then this guy over here is even shitter, and that's half the problem. Yeah, these are really tough questions to ask, really hard ones to find answers for. Then you've got sometimes to work with player development. Look, when Carrigan came to this mouse sports team and he had to work with a bunch of players that were inexperienced, some of them barely ever played at tier 1. There's man management. How do I resolve arguments? Work with big egos. Put the shy guy in a position where he won't just get brutalized by the one who's talking all the time. The key aspect here is this concept, because it's a concept that's been lost in sort of, I would say, European and American culture, which is it's the mentor-mentee relationship of this guy has some knowledge and he got some of it from his mentor and he's passing it down to his mentee or his protege. And it's the relationship between two of them that's passing the knowledge down from one to one to one. And if they explain it correctly, it's coming all the way down in the purest form imaginable. The purest actual approach to this is father to son. That is the ultimate way to pass knowledge because in theory, they have similar genetics to you, basically almost the same. And so there might even be some component where, first of all, it's like you're trying to teach him to drive the same car that you drive. And then secondly, maybe there's even some genetic memory component. Remember, no one really knows where memory's studied and stored in the body. The whole blank slate concept of like humankind and human nature seems to have absolutely abjectly failed and be based on very small sample size studies. So there's even an interesting element right there. And so that's one thing we've lost. We go out there and we learn from a guy who had a different car to us, who drove in a different way, drove in a different country. We learn in such a fucked up way. So to me, the interesting thing about this is keep your eye on some of the people like Magisk who maybe have the chance later to be an IGL under those people, MSL from gla1ve, from Hunden, these aspects, Carrigan to God B, existence to Hearts, then all the people under existence, because it's not like because existence is gone, because Hearts is gone, because God B is gone, because Hunden to some degree is gone. It's not like we've lost them. They're still here right now, present in their proteges, in their mentees, and the people that they had an impact on, sometimes almost speaking through them, through time, through the ages from when they were at their peaks. This video was kindly supported by Pronogo, Mohammed, Alabdul, Razzaq, Dean Tanglis, James Pederson, VatriSam, ErikHillestad, Andreas Kroknes, Hades, Zoomba Gaming, JDubs, Tobias Bernasconi, and Alexander Rao. Special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for one of my upcoming episodes? Maybe you want to ask more of those questions in that video AMA I do each month. Do you want teasers? Find out who the next guests are for my shows. Well, maybe you even want to take part in one of those crazy donated discussions where we go all over the place. If any of these perks appeal to you or you want to support the channel, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrolluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.